Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic earthquake that Western officials had feared, anticipated, and desperately tried to prevent. A decision that unfolded not over months of careful deliberation, but in 72 hours of intense closed-door negotiations in Berlin. 72 hours that rewrote the security architecture of Europe. 72 hours that left NATO allies scrambling for answers. 72 hours that gave Vladimir Putin something he has demanded since February 2022. What Ukraine announced today crossed a line that the Atlantic Alliance had hoped would hold the line between negotiation and capitulation. And when that announcement came, the Kremlin did not hesitate. They responded not with gratitude, not with reciprocation, but with threat, escalation, and a direct warning that sent shockwaves through every Western capital. For weeks now, there had been signals not from official diplomatic channels, not from formal government statements, just whispers that Ukraine was preparing something unprecedented. President Zelensky has been defiant, yes, but he has been increasingly isolated in his defiance. His moves have followed a certain desperation, a pragmatism, almost a resignation. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this month was that the usual rhetoric went silent. Intelligence analysts, who monitor diplomatic communications, know the indicators. The sudden cancellation of scheduled press conferences. The unusual frequency of encrypted calls between Kyiv and Berlin. The unexplained departure of key Ukrainian negotiators from public view. The sudden absence of Zelensky from social media. All of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something massive is about to be announced. Early this morning, European intelligence services detected what they described as a complete shift in Ukrainian diplomatic posture, including draft agreements that had not been circulated in over 3 years. These are the kinds of concessions that Ukraine only offers when they are signaling something very specific: exhaustion, strategic recalibration, or imminent collapse. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Ukraine was fundamentally changing its negotiating position. And when a wartime government shifts strategy without prior consultation with allies, even by a single degree, NATO pays very close attention. The announcement came at 2:14 p.m. Berlin time. President Zelensky, flanked by German Chancellor and French President, stated plainly that Ukraine would formally withdraw its application for NATO membership as a precondition for renewed peace negotiations with Russia. The room fell silent. Decades of Western security promises gone in a single sentence. The response issued by the Kremlin tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not diplomatic. It was threatening. Russian officials, after emergency Security Council meetings, described their position as uncompromising, escalatory, and perhaps most importantly, contingent on further concessions that go far beyond NATO membership. But strategic concessions only work if the aggressor is satisfied. Russia was not. In fact, their response today was among the most threatening we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within hours of Ukraine's announcement, Russia demanded immediate territorial recognition of all occupied regions. These weren't the standard diplomatic requests. These were ultimatums, demands that Russia only issues when they are preparing to escalate militarily if refused. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov warned that any failure to meet additional Russian demands would result in direct and proportional retaliation against Ukrainian decision-making centers. That is a threat to strike Kyiv directly. Tonight, multiple intelligence sources confirmed that Russia mobilized additional strike capabilities toward the Ukrainian border, including hypersonic missile systems that had recently been repositioned for what analysts believe was exactly this contingency. Russia escalated before Ukraine could even implement the concession. They demanded Crimea recognition. They demanded Donbass autonomy. They demanded demilitarization terms that would leave Ukraine defenseless against future aggression. In other words, Russia targeted not just NATO membership, they targeted Ukrainian sovereignty itself, the statehood that would have made any peace agreement meaningful. This is what made Western warnings so urgent. Ukraine's concession wasn't just symbolic, it was existential. It represented the kind of capitulation that could embolden Russian aggression across the entire post-Soviet space if left unchallenged. And Western allies, understanding that fully, responded with alarm. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with growing concern about what comes next. They didn't abandon Ukraine publicly. They didn't celebrate the potential for peace. They warned that Russia's demands make genuine peace nearly impossible. They warned that capitulation breeds more demands. And here's where the story becomes even more troubling. Intelligence officials now believe that Russia's response was designed to test the resolve of Western support after months of political uncertainty in Washington and Berlin. Putin wanted to see whether Ukraine's concession would fracture the Western alliance. But instead, something unexpected happened. NATO allies didn't celebrate the peace process. They issued a joint statement that was so strongly worded, so coordinated, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, the Western response did. Security analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described Russia's escalation as predictable aggression, a way to extract maximum concessions while the other side is negotiating in good faith. But Western capitals proved today that they remain both skeptical and vigilant. Their statements were not only coordinated, they were calibrated so precisely that they arrived within minutes of each other. That synchronization matters because it shows unity despite internal disagreements. It shows that the West is not abandoning Ukraine to face Russia's demands alone. They are watching every move Moscow makes. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Russia's demands. Russian negotiators demanded complete withdrawal of all Western military equipment from Ukrainian territory, forcing Kyiv to consider total disarmament. Moscow targeted the remaining defense agreements that had been signed in the last 18 months. Russian diplomats operating in Geneva reportedly presented additional demands regarding Ukrainian governance used by Kyiv to maintain Western integration. This wasn't just negotiation. This wasn't just diplomacy. This was coercion. This was strategic extortion. And strategic extortion is the one thing the Western alliance has struggled to counter since February 2022. For every concession Ukraine has made, Russia has countered with demands that make the original concession meaningless. Remember, Putin thought NATO would fracture under pressure. He thought Western support would collapse after the first winter. He thought Ukraine would surrender within weeks of the initial invasion. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening even as Ukraine makes unprecedented concessions. NATO is issuing its strongest collective statements in months. European defense spending is accelerating, not decreasing. And Ukrainian civil society is pushing back against their own government's decision. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Ukraine's decision happened at a time when President Zelensky is under extraordinary domestic pressure. Military commanders want continued Western weapons. Political opposition wants accountability for battlefield losses. Civil society wants democratic processes respected. International partners want diplomatic progress. Zelensky is balancing these demands while facing an enemy that has shown no interest in genuine compromise. And when leaders in that position make sudden concessions, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. NATO's statement, now circulating through every major news outlet, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to accept peace at any price. Officials said plainly that Russia's response was inconsistent with genuine diplomatic engagement. That is diplomatic language for Russia is not negotiating in good faith, and everyone knows it. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The future of European security is at stake. The credibility of Western promises is at stake. And the sovereignty of a nation fighting for survival is at stake. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed his nation in a somber, exhausted speech tonight. He said, "We have made difficult choices that previous generations never had to make." He said, "Peace requires sacrifice, but sacrifice must lead to genuine security." And he said, "If Russia continues to escalate despite our good faith, the world will see clearly who wants peace and who wants conquest." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a president who understands just how high the stakes have become and how limited his options are. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's demands weren't isolated. Along with rejecting the NATO concession as insufficient, All Belarusian forces also began new exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian cyber operations intensified attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Russian state media increased propaganda targeting Western European audiences. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing to launch a new offensive despite the peace talks. Another is that Moscow is attempting to split Western allies by appearing to negotiate while making impossible demands. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish a new baseline where any future negotiations start from even more extreme demands. But today, the Western response took that card off the table. They didn't celebrate prematurely. They didn't pressure Ukraine for more concessions. They didn't abandon their commitments. They stood firm and warned Russia that escalation has consequences. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if threats can extract unlimited concessions. Ukraine wants to show that peace is possible without total surrender. NATO wants to prevent the collapse of European security architecture. And the global community wants to prevent a precedent where aggression is rewarded with territorial gains. Tonight, we've heard from defense officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements intensively. They say additional forces have been detected moving toward forward positions. They say Russian rhetoric suggests more demands are coming within days, and they say Russia's decision to escalate threats is likely part of a maximum pressure campaign intended to force Ukraine into complete capitulation. But Ukraine is not surrendering entirely. In fact, Ukraine is maintaining defensive capabilities and Western partnerships. Their decision today, painful, controversial, and historic, sent a message to Russia that dialogue is possible, and it sent a message to the West that Ukraine needs continued support more than ever. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with their threatening response. But what we do know is that NATO's unified statement was timely. It prevented Russia from claiming complete diplomatic victory. It reassured Ukraine that Western support continues despite internal disagreements. And it warned Moscow that further escalation will not go unanswered. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of genuine negotiations. If they escalate further, Western allies have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to support Ukrainian sovereignty. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be calculating its next move very carefully. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after making threats, it means they are watching Western reactions. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he should have understood long ago. Concessions do not satisfy aggressors. Threats do not fracture determined alliances. And history does not forgive those who reward conquest with territory. This story is far from over, but tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine made a painful choice for peace. Russia responded with demands for surrender. And the world is watching to see which vision prevails, and we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this historic confrontation unfolds.